By the way, I'd like to introduce this and myself. My name is Doug White. I am the Academic Director of the Hyman Center for Philanthropy and Fundraising, a program within SCPS, the School for Continuing Education here at NYU, which is housed at NYU. We have an interesting program, I think, at the Hyman Center. We teach people how to raise money, and we also teach people how to give it away. We also have a growing presence in the world as we have expanded our efforts throughout the world. We have 25% of our summer program, which is coming up soon, that is occupied by students from other countries. And our growing master's program also has many students from other countries as well. So we are becoming more and more a leader in the international context for philanthropy and fundraising, which is where we want to go, because the world, as we all know, is getting smaller, and we can all learn better from one another. And the Hyman Center intends to be a leader in the educational world for philanthropy and fundraising. So it's our pleasure to be a part of this whole process, and a part of that process is this series. This is the 6th and final luncheon series of the academic year 2010-2011. And it has been nothing but a success, a surprise beyond our wildest imagination, because we have had not only good people coming to this, but we've had excellent people speaking at this session all throughout the year. We're very fortunate, and again today we are fortunate to have another topic on this series that we call Disruptive Philanthropy. Right now I'd like to introduce the person who's responsible for all of this, and when I say that I mean that, because a year ago we had nothing more than just a twinkle in someone's eye, but this person really put it all together, and it takes a lot of imagination and a lot of guts to do it. And we have now anointed her as our social media advisor, and she's also the curator of this whole program. And so I would love to have you welcome Marcia Stepanek.
Thank you, Doug. Let me just creep behind here. Welcome, everyone. We're delighted to close off this series with this panel today. And for those of you tweeting, the hashtag is NYU Hyman, NYU-HEYMAN. So you have the bios in the packet. I'm not going to delay this any further, but I just want to introduce to my near right and your left, Richard McPherson, Laura Fredericks, Andrew Richet, John Wunderlich, and our moderator today, Tom Watson. He is the managing partner and founder of CauseWired. That's a consulting firm advising clients on the social commons, nonprofits, foundations, and companies. Tom is a journalist, author, media critic, entrepreneur, and consultant. He's worked at the confluence of media technology and social change for more than 15 years. And he's the author of a really terrific book, which I'm sure most of you have read. And if you haven't, I highly recommend it, CauseWired. Plugging in, getting involved, and changing the world. Tom, take it away.
Thank you, Marcia. Thanks for that terrific introduction, and I just want to say it's a tremendous pleasure to be here today. As Marcia said, I did do a book 2 years ago called CauseWired, and I was cautiously optimistic about where our newly networked and newly wired world would take us from the viewpoint of early to mid 2008. I don't think I necessarily foresaw everything that would indeed happen. And I must state at the outset of this panel that we are living in very interesting times. Those of us who work daily in the social sector or at the confluence of government and activism, we face swirling changes that many of us who are in mid-career have never seen before. The walls are falling, and what we used to call nonprofit activism has really broadened. So some of the questions we want to look at today start off with, will the nonprofit sector be left behind by this change? Is collaboration some of the partnerships that we've seen talked about over the last couple of years real? Does it make change? Can government and nonprofits work together to create this social change, really make a better society? And frankly, very importantly, will organizations that provide social services, that provide some of the things that government has failed to provide, can they thrive? From Egypt to Wisconsin, people are in the streets and on their smartphones. And I think the pace of change has really picked up. The actors in this change movement are younger, and the information is everywhere. So in my view, this is a real moment in time. And today's topic is intentionally very, very broad. So I'll ask our panel to try and provide examples in their own professional lives as we move forward to kind of give you a sense of where we are. I'm going to start out by asking each of the panelists to make an opening statement, to speak to you for 6 or 7 minutes about their particular area, and then we're going to get into some Q&A. And please get your questions ready, because we will have some extensive time for you to converse with our all-star panel. I'd like to start out with Andrew Richet, who I've known for a long time. Andrew is the co-founder of the Personal Democracy Forum, along with many other organizations and firms. So Andrew, if you don't mind starting us off and getting us into this topic.
So, good morning, everybody. So I've been in the arena of nonprofit work and politics for about 13 years. I used to own a nightclub in New York called Irving Plaza, which many of you have heard of. And I walked across the street in 1997 into that building as part of a business group trying to help that school out. And is the mic working? Here we go. And walked in, and there were 3,000 kids in that school, and there wasn't a single computer anywhere to be found. And so I started a program to wire the school, and ended up creating an organization called Mouse that wired about 50 schools in New York, and now runs a program training students in public schools all around the country and around the world to fix and maintain computers. I think we're in like 26 countries around the world. So, but the most important statistic around that project was that in New York, about 90% of the kids who are in our program graduate and go to college. So I'm a big believer in that technology changes the equation. That experience brought me to the world of politics, and I decided that and the reason why is because I believe that politicians, to a large degree, control a great deal of the money that goes to public education. And I would like to say that this is no longer true, but it actually still is true to a large degree, is that politicians still don't know the difference between a server and a waiter. And I've been studying this for a while and working with various candidates, organizations, and and in fact, I even ran for public advocate here in 2005, and on a platform to make New York City wireless and as modern as possible. And just to give you a sense of how frustrating that experience was, for all the typical reasons, like standing on subway corners, shaking people's hands, and people telling you you're an idiot. When I went to the New York Times editorial board for my endorsement interview, and you would think that the New York Times editorial board would be some of the most knowledgeable people in the country, I had to spend about 45 minutes of my hour explaining to them what Wi-Fi was. This was 2005. So when I ran, we didn't have Twitter, we didn't have Facebook, we didn't have any of the, YouTube, we didn't have any of the social media tools. And so in the last 2 years or 3 years, there has been a massive, massive change related to the use of these tools. But I want to tell you a quick story about, as you think about these tools, which you're familiar with, or you're reading about, or learning about how they actually change not just the way in which people interact, but the speed at which information is shared. So about 6 months before, well, let me just say this. And I think you'll agree with me. Most political opinion is formed by people talking to each other. They do it around dining tables, around water coolers, over the back fence in their backyards, at a PTA meeting, and they share their aspirations, their hopes, their prejudices, and eventually a consensus is formed and people go to the polls. And the political parties and organizations and the candidates have been trying to influence that discussion, and they do it mostly, or had been in modern times, mostly through television advertising and sometimes direct mail, and spin doctoring wherever possible with talking heads. So John Kerry's a flip-flopper, John McCain's a maverick, Barack Obama's a Muslim, whatever. Eventually, there's some sort of consensus and people go and vote. So about 6 months before the 2008 presidential campaign, my 84-year-old dad calls me up and asks me to come over to his house to help him with his email because he doesn't know how to send more than one email at a time. He wants to send it to a group. And for those of you who have ever spent any time trying to tell your parents how to use a computer over the phone, you realize that it's a lot easier to just get in the car and drive over and show them yourself. So I go over to his house and I'm looking over his shoulder and show him how to use his address book. And then I ask him to show me the email that he wants to send. And lo and behold, the subject line is "Watch this." And he's sending around a Barack Obama YouTube video to his 50 friends, one at a time. And I realized that my father had become a 21st century political pamphleteer and didn't even know it. Because in a previous election cycle, my father would have never picked up the phone and called his friends. He wouldn't have gone to a rally and held up a sign. He might have put in $25 for a candidate he cared about. But if he was sitting around a dining room table and the subject of politics came up, he would have opened his mouth and offered his opinion. Well, here he was in one afternoon reaching the same 50 people. It would have taken him a year and a half to reach the old-fashioned way. So we then started to look and see, well, what about the people who actually know how to send more than one email at a time, know how to produce a YouTube video, know how to use social media? And so listen to this statistic. In the 2008 presidential campaign, there were 1.5 billion views of online video that mentioned Obama or McCain in the title of the video. But only 150 million of those 1.5 billion views were views of videos that were produced by the candidates or the parties themselves. So 9 out of 10, 1,350,000,000 online videos that mention Obama or McCain were produced by citizens trying to influence each other. And so what I'm trying to illustrate for you is that the advocacy media ecology, the opinion-forming media ecology has dramatically changed because citizens are now producing content, sharing content, and taking that conversation that used to happen around a water cooler and putting it on steroids. So what does that have to do? What does this have to do with philanthropy? And what does it have to do with government's role in this arena? So in the last 2 years, mostly through policy work of organizations like the Sunlight Foundation and people working in policy areas at other think tanks and including the Obama administration, there is a new era of government data that's being made available to the public in forms that allow people to interact with that data, to use that data, to make sense of it, and to extract information that might be useful to solving problems, raising money, creating awareness. So if you think about government using technology, you probably have heard the term e-government. So e-government is where government agencies are using the technology tools that we use every day to deliver the services that we expect them to deliver. So pay your parking tickets online, check your taxes, maybe apply for a grant, see what the schedule is in the local park. Those kinds of services are happening. But there's a new era coming, and we have a lot of evidence of this, and hopefully we can give you a couple examples today, where government is making the data that they collect available publicly, and then citizens are actually collecting data through these devices that we call smartphones every day as they walk the streets. And people are starting to combine that data and make it useful for people in their civic lives. And we call that we government, not e-government. And that's where citizens are actually working at innovation faster than government is and are building tools, platforms, and applications that are just useful for people in their civic lives. And so this has huge implications for the world of philanthropy because the amount of data that is available now for organizations that are trying to solve problems from a philanthropic perspective is so massive that organizations need to start thinking about technology not as a slice of the pie, but really as the pan that actually supports everything they do. The information they collect, how they generate revenue, how they interact with their communities, how they interact with other nonprofit organizations within their space, how they interact with government, and how they actually, in the end, make themselves obsolete so that the problem that they were intended to solve goes away. And so I'm an optimist that we are entering a renaissance of nonprofit work combined with government information and citizen action. And I'm very anxious to hear your questions and to hear what you're working on and see if you can participate in that future that I see. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. John, you're up next. You could start us out with 30 seconds on the Sunlight Foundation, too, because I think people would like to hear more about that.
Sure, thanks. So my name is John Wunderlich. I'm Policy Director for the Sunlight Foundation. We are a DC-based nonprofit devoted to creating a more open and accountable government, especially through technology. And we were founded in 2006, which I think was the right time for an organization of this type to be started. If you think of what's happened in the last 5 years, we're actually approaching our 5th birthday. In addition to being able to work with Andrew and other people like him that are directly approaching this kind of problem, we've really been in the middle of the changes that have happened with technology and the way that the government is approaching being open. And from my perspective of being involved in that fight for the last 5 years, I think that the first lesson is that we're only beginning to see the kinds of changes that Andrew's describing. We're only at the very beginning of it. And I just have a couple of quick anecdotes to describe why I think that's the case. First of all, the first example I want to give you is about tracking legislation. And so if you're a citizen and you go online and Google the name of bill, say healthcare bill or PPACA or bailout bill or HR1, if you type any of those phrases into Google, there's a chance that you'll get the official website of the Library of Congress called Thomas. But there's an even better chance that you'll get a website called Open Congress or GovTrack. And those two websites were created by people who have no affiliation with government at all, with some degree of support from the Sunlight Foundation, but they both started before we even existed. The Library of Congress's yearly budget is about $400 or $500 million a year. It's a very large institution. And the websites that were built independently by developers, the first one actually, GovTrack, was built by a single linguistics student who was getting his PhD at UPenn in 2003 or 2004, and he said, wow, I'm really interested in internet radio. He looked up a bill, and he said, I want to know every time that bill changes. So he took his computer and set up a program to check every day and see if the bill had moved at all. And he said, as long as I'm doing that, I might as well have this program set up to check every bill from the Library of Congress and see if it's changed. And as long as I'm doing that, I'm not going to keep it to myself. I'll just build a website so that anyone can see how those bills are changing. And that process of him doing that for himself with zero budget and no help on nights and weekends, he ended up presenting all of the bills for the US Congress in a way that is far better than Congress did with their $400 million a year budget. And this is one guy. And because of the way that he's making that information available, other sites like opencongress.org and any of the other sites that you see that present bills online rely on that data. Now that's an important thing to me because these websites and projects exist in order to democratize access to legislation. And up to now, if you want to follow legislation, you would pay a lobbyist, pay an insider, or subscribe to an expensive commercial service that basically hires people to follow every bill as it happens. It's very expensive $10,000 a year services that do this. But those mechanisms that really hold up already influential people are being subverted with the more democratic access created by independent web programmers and developers building tools on their own. And that's example one, is we're seeing democratized access to how the US Congress works. Second example for why we're only beginning to see the changes that we're talking about. Today's the anniversary of the Deepwater Horizon disaster. And I think the immediate thing we think of when we think of that disaster is the horrible mechanical failure. And we have these pictures of golf balls and rubber and cement being shoved through this hole and the image of oil bulging out. But I also think of not just the mechanical failure, but a regulatory failure, because the Department of Interior was responsible for making sure that this sort of thing didn't happen. The Department of Interior instead instead of filling out inspections on the wells that were created, they would fill them out in pencil or hand over blank forms and let the oil well operators fill them out themselves and hand them back. It was an agency that was not functioned properly at all. The heart of the way that the American government is supposed to regulate offshore drilling is through disclosure. There are inspections, but there are also a variety of specific things that people engaged in drilling are supposed to fill out and disclose publicly. Things like development and production plans or other specific forms where they say, if there's a disaster, here is the kind of ecological or economic damage that we can expect to see. And that exercise of disclosing things publicly is supposed to force them to prepare for the worst. Well, what happened, though, instead, is that one company filled out the form once, and then they all copied and pasted it. So we ended up with forms, we only found out after the disaster, that said that no walruses would be harmed if the Deepwater Horizon disaster happened. Well, there are no walruses in the Gulf of Mexico, so clearly somebody filled out an examination of what would be harmed for drilling off the coast of Alaska or somewhere else, and then just copied and pasted it, and no one actually did the preparation that they were supposed to. So if you look at the way American government is supposed to be regulating the entities that they oversee, disclosure is at the heart of it. But a lot of that disclosure doesn't work because it's disclosure by paper, through a field office located somewhere in Louisiana that nobody ever pays attention to until a month after the biggest ecological disaster in American history. So that's the reason that we've become interested in looking at ways to take public information that's at the heart of the way government's supposed to function and putting it online where it'll actually have an effect. And to that end, Sunlight's been working with Representative Steve Israel because Andrew at the PDF conference 2 years ago, got Representative Israel to commit to writing a bill to require public information to be posted online. That bill is called the Public Online Information Act, which is being reintroduced this year, and we're hopeful that we'll be able to see progress on getting that passed, because this sort of example comes up over and over again where we've got public information that needs to be online to really get teeth. So those are the three examples that I have, and I think these changes are only going to accelerate because our expectations of what should be shared online are only going to grow.
Thanks, John. And I want to come back to that whole idea of the pace of change and how it may involve aspects of the philanthropy sector. But let's go to Richard next, who has a presentation to share with us. Richard?
I'm using the oldest of all possible technologies. It's called PowerPoint. And they tell me that I can just simply do this. Oops. Sorry, friends. Thank you, Marcia. I'm going to ask, well, Marcia, I have only like 4 pictures, but it is really a glimpse of the future. How many of you work for government at any level? Local, state, federal, anyone? Okay, I won't ask you to identify your agency. How many work for a nonprofit organization? Hands high, be proud, okay. Others, business, academia, okay, undecided, okay. I do this because there's a pretty obvious debate going on right now, and the examples that I'm going to show you are the debate, but not over transparency of what is getting funded, but what should get funded. I think we're all observing what's happening in Washington. I wanted to show you something. There are 9 states now, and more coming all the time, that have foundations for the community colleges in their states. This is nothing new. Public universities, public schools even have foundations and so forth. These are, of course, growing at a rapid rate because government claims it cannot fund them any longer. And what is a little less traditional, many of you probably know Kickstarter.com. Yeah, where you can aggregate individual gifts for very specific projects. Been used for colleges and schools and so forth. The mayor of Portland, Oregon, now has a Kickstarter page because they want to see how many people in Portland or not are willing to support specific projects, partly because their arts budget was beleaguered, to say the least. This is growing very rapidly, and what you'll see is cities, states, counties, other government agencies going to places like Kickstarter and trying to generate individual support for activities that used to be may yet again be paid for and funded by the government. And I'll tell you why we're going to... Now, a couple of these are just fun. Government is advertising everywhere. There is now a company that sells space on school buses. There's a lot of controversy because many schools have outlawed sweet drinks and sugary things in their vending machines, but are happy to run ads in the school for those very same products because it's a little bit of money. whatever you do, do not get busted in Buffalo. With an $81 million a year budget, the Sheriff's Department in Buffalo has decreed this as of now. If you are arrested in Buffalo, you will be forced to watch a video, possibly cruel and unusual punishment, for those of you who are lawyers. In the video are ads, because at generating only $8,000 or $10,000 a year out of an $81 million budget, the county of Erie, New York will take the money. The ads are for bail bondsmen and lawyers, as you would expect. So when government is advertising to people who have been arrested and are in jail, and to our school students, and are going on Kickstarter.com to raise money for projects, we have a nascent debate over what is being funded, what is necessary to fund, what is desirable to fund. Why is this important to us? Oh, by the way, the last example I loved. Everybody paid their taxes, or at least filed their taxes on Monday, or before Monday, I hope. Do you know you can get an itemized receipt? How do you think you could get an itemized receipt? This was news to me. Yeah, if you go to whitehouse.gov/tax receipt, you come to a neat little form. All you have to do is put in what you paid in federal taxes, Social Security, and so forth. Or just pick a category. If you don't know that by heart, you can just say so much income, so many deductions, and it will itemize for you by percentage and exact dollar amount. In this case, I think we put in $60,000 a year, 2 children, exactly what you're paying for everything from defense and interest to all the other activities of government. This, of course, is being encouraged. By the way, it's a lot of fun if you want to really see what's happening to your money. And of course, it isn't exactly what's happening to your money, but it is part of the Obama administration's effort to make sure that the debate about what government should and should not do and fund and so forth, and cut or raise taxes, at least starts with some factual information. Much public debate is in an information-free zone. It's mostly emotional. And as we know, there is nothing more emotional than a discussion of money. Very few things are more emotional than that. I put these examples up because the nonprofit culture in general is famously non-political. Except for some organizations devoted to a particular issue, many nonprofits, especially in education, the arts, and so forth, try very, very hard, as they should, to avoid the political debate. Increasingly, the debate is going to be between the decisions that government has decided to make. Do we have a National Endowment for the Arts or Humanities? Does New York City State have a funded council on the arts or not? Do we decide to invest in an educational tour of our state park system? Things that are by no definition controversial are going to become controversial. And what it's going to do is cause nonprofits not only to, 2 things, to face government as a potential partner if we agree with their funding decisions, we being our nonprofit, and we'll all together try to raise money with the mayor of Portland, Oregon to make sure kids get arts education in schools. It will also cause nonprofits to have the issue of supporting one policy when the local or state or federal government has picked another policy in terms of its funding priorities. So I think that while we are understandably paying a lot of attention to accountability of actions, responsibility, both in the government and corporate world, we're going to see this increasingly and somewhat uncomfortable relationship when government is looking to the same people nonprofits are looking for money. It's a fantasy, of course, to think that charitable giving can make up for government not taking on its responsibility. And also the uncomfortable position that nonprofits will have to take when they are raising money using technology and grassroots efforts and all of their influence for something the government has specifically decided it does not want to fund. So we have some political and some communications and some fundraising challenges, and those are my few comments, and I pass it off to Dr. Tom for whoever's next.
Thank you, Richard. Laura is next, and while she is switching over to her presentation, I think that issue of competing for dollars and for the budget money that's out there is going to be key. How many people here are responsible for fundraising for their, or at least in part, responsible for fundraising for their organizations? Higher, I can't see. It's pretty high amount, about 50%. So I think the issue of resources and about perhaps crowdsourcing those resources and figuring out how we go about keeping the supply of funding to existing not-for-profits that provide crucial social services to the community is key, even as more innovative, change-oriented new organizations spring up. So I think that's something to keep in mind, and we'll just, we're switching out laptops here.
I'll get started while he's doing it. You might have to power it on and off, I'm not sure. Hello, everyone. I was asked, thank you by Marcia, this came out of a meeting, to talk about what's happening, at least in one part of the international world. I was invited by the Russian government this past February to come and speak about how is it possible that the United States, in the second full year of a recession, could raise $303 billion. And this was just, so anyway, what they had was, it was fascinating. 2 days was the Global Economic Conference. And the Troika Bank, which could be the JP Morgan Bank here, literally flew in 2,100 financial investors from all over the world to just think about how, what's happening with emerging markets, developed countries. But more importantly, and about today, is the third day, and this is the first time they've done that, is they had a day on philanthropy. Now here you have 2,100 most brilliant people investing billions of dollars around the globe. Why would they tack on a day of philanthropy? Well, the Russian government is tremendously focusing on the social sector as much as it is the economic sector. And they want to know, it's so interesting, what's the American model and how can it work here in Russia? So imagine talking to 2,100 financial people about how we raise money and on, but it's all a part of what Russia is doing now, and that is making this sector between government, economics, and philanthropy one. I know, hard to believe, but they are putting a lot of time, money, and energy into it. If I can get the website up, I will, and if I can't, I can't, but I'll show you. I did include the handout about it. When I did that, and it was fine, I did a series of meetings when I was in Moscow, and I came across a group, and this is based actually in DC. It's called the Institute for Republican, I forgot what the I is, but I'll look it up with you and I will talk. They hired through a grant through the United States a gentleman who is actually, he created what I consider the Facebook platform for nonprofits in Russia. And one of my first pieces of advice for them is to drop the NGO language, because the minute people hear the word government, they think corruption, and they think if they're going to give this to a nonprofit, it really goes to the state. So I'm trying to develop their language to be a softer, gentler kind of language, to say nonprofits and charities like we do here in the United States. Well, anyway, possible to get the website? Working on it, that's okay. And I can give it to you. I don't know what the call letters stand for. We're working, it's called WINKO, it's in your packet, .ru. And what the whole piece of this is to bring together nonprofits, government, and business as one. And they're starting from the ground up, and they've chosen Moscow, but they're throughout Russia. So what it is content to promote your charity. They then say, okay, this charity might want this information from these government agencies, and it puts content on. And then businesses say, well, I might be interested in the work that this nonprofit does, and maybe I can get some government financing, so it's one big circle. And it's actually working, and it's transforming a lot. Talk about legislation. When I was there, I'm not sure I'm thrilled about this, but they were. And for the first time, the whole thing about nonprofits, obviously, in Russia is transparency and corruption. Because for years, it was viewed that if you give this to the nonprofit, literally you're giving it to the government. So they have to dispel this, and this platform is one piece of it. When I was there, they were very happy. They don't have tax laws like we do. They don't have tax incentives like we do. So one of the things that they are about to embark upon, I'm not sure it's passed, but I'll be back in May, is that if the government has deemed charity X to be a good charity, and a citizen gives to that charity, then they'll receive a portion of a tax return, or tax abatement. Now, that can be great if you were one of the charities that are chosen, and it can be lousy if you're not. So in other words, I think the government has created their own United Way, if you will, who's a checkoff and who's not. Well, that's a step in the right direction, but then again, the whole thing of transparency is, how do you get selected to be one of the charity of choices of the government in Russia? So anyway, I think, in my speaking today, it's been fascinating to watch this develop. they are going to take this platform, they're trying to get this here in the United States into other countries, and to sort of be the thread tying it through today is, this is happening much faster than if the government itself had tried to do this. And it took, this group of young people, naturally, putting this together, and I think this is really going to take off and be very, very beneficial for all the three sectors.
Thank you. And that's an excellent story. And it really clearly illustrates that throughout the world, there are a lot of startups, a lot of new structures coming into place. Frankly, we have to admit to ourselves it's not all Facebook and Twitter and US-based and Google and US-based companies. There's a lot of things coming along. I want to start with you guys down this end and talk about what the Obama administration has done. I was at the Global Philanthropy Forum last week, and I was listening to Sonal Shah from the White House talk about how they're getting data out. And I found it really interesting and very much pushing the availability of large amounts of government data. And her pitch was that the philanthropy sector, that nonprofits, that venture philanthropists and funds of that ilk should be using this data. But she was asked, what are you doing to increase the use of the data? And she kind of backed off. She basically indicated, well, that's really not our job. It was almost kind of a laissez-faire view of the data out there. And I think a lot of people came, the Obama administration coming in, there was obviously a very big, there was very big talk of rapid change. And I think if government and philanthropy share one attribute, rapid change is not among them. So if you guys could, please comment on the pace of change in Washington, what this administration and this Congress is sort of doing, and whether you are personally satisfied with it.
Well, we're not satisfied, to start with. I think candidate Obama had an enormous amount to live up to as president. And there were a lot of important and transformative things that were done very early on that we are very excited about. We have a lot to complain about as well. If you look at things like the budget negotiations that all just happened, that was a group of 10 people that basically met in secret over and over again. We only found out what they were doing through leaks and contradictory press releases, and then they, at the end of a matter of weeks, came together and said, here's what we've decided our national priorities are. So I don't think that there's much we can brag about from an open political standpoint there. But as far as sharing data, what they've done is transformative with especially data.gov. And this is on my mind right now because data.gov and a lot of other sites like it were almost cut out of the budget. $34 million goes to an e-government fund. The initial Republican plan cut that down to $2 million, and that's a 95% cut. And we fought to have that reinstated back up to $8 million. That's one of the few situations where a proposed cut was rolled back so dramatically because they realized what it was they were going to cut. And I just want to say, there are a lot of things I could complain about the pace of Washington change being slow and political promises for transparency being hollow. But I do want to say that what we've got here and what the Obama administration committed to with sharing data is unique and is leading the rest of the world. Our government is jumping through hoops to try to encourage people to reuse it. That quote may have just been that person who didn't want to commit to sharing more. But in a lot of the rest of the world, even the countries that are more open, in a lot of EU countries, you have to apply for a license to reuse public sector information. A license. It's like
that makes no sense to us.
Yeah, it's just crazy.
It's our information.
Yeah, and so our government, the American government, is really leading the way in thinking through how to share data and encourage people to reuse it for accountability or new businesses or whatever kind of innovation makes sense.
And I think that last thing you said, encourage people to use it, is sort of key. And there are some interesting examples of that, but yet there's not necessarily, it's not a wave, and it's particularly in our sector, the nonprofit sector, of people using that data. Andrew, you have any thoughts about how our sector, the nonprofit sector, should be using that data, and whether the government should in fact be trying to partner more?
Well, I think that where the data is usable, they should use it, but nonprofit organizations can collect a lot of data on their own that's not necessarily being made available by the government. To just help frame and add to what John said, we have to remember that this technology is brand new. It just, really, it's 13 years old. I mean, in 1997, if you got a business card from somebody who didn't have an email address on it, you wouldn't have thought twice. And a website address on the front, on a full-page ad in the New York Times would be in the lower right-hand corner in the smallest possible letters. And Jack Welch, who was the president of GE, was telling people that the internet was going to go away and was a fad. That was only 13 years ago. Another thing we have to remember is that these changes that we're trying to implement are not really technological. They're actually anthropological. Very few people realize this, but whenever we elect a president from another party, we actually send the country back 8 years in time. Because you only have 9 weeks for a transition from the election day to the inauguration. So you've got to go find the people in your party who had their hands on their steering wheel the last time your party was in power. And in the battle for power in the new administration, people are very risk averse. They only go back to what they know. So people go back to what they knew the last time they were in a given agency or in government. So we, in effect, actually got a Clinton White House with the Obama administration.
A Clinton transition, a Clinton cabinet.
I mean, if you look at the people who are, William Daley, former Commerce Secretary. If you look at Rahm Emanuel, former Chief of Staff of Clinton.
Secretary of State Clinton.
Secretary of State Clinton. By the way, very people realize, those of you who are interested in broadband and net neutrality issues, William Daley, who's the Chief of Staff right now, was the former president of SBC Communications. How many of you know what SBC Communications is? So SBC, for those who don't know, is actually AT&T. AT&T was going out of business about 7 years ago, and SBC, Southern Bell, bought AT&T and changed its name because they thought that was the global name that would make sense. And so the former president of the largest telco in the United States is now Chief of Staff to the President of the United States. So that gives you, and then ask yourself the question about why is the United States broadband 20% less powerful than broadband in other developing countries? Why do we still have a digital divide? Why aren't we creating innovation? And you start realizing that this is not a technological issue. This is a issue associated with anthropology, sociology, and political dysfunctionality, and if some people like to use this word, corruption, not on an individual basis, but on a holistic, systematic basis, it would probably be appropriate. So to go back to Tom to answer your question, there are really great examples of where nonprofit entities are creating tools and platforms that interact with government information, and then government, in effect, adopts them. The best example I can give you is a platform called Ushahidi, which means witness in Swahili. And in 2008, there was an election in Kenya, which was quite problematic. After the election, there was a great deal of violence because the government the government was believed fixed the election and was cracking down on protesters, and the government also controlled the main media outlets in Kenya and refused to report on the violence that was occurring when government forces cracked down on democratic protesters. So a young woman there got together with some developers, software developers around the world, and created a real simple tool that allowed people to text incidents of violence and post it on a Google map. And in a matter of weeks was able to physically show the world that there was a great deal of violence happening where the media in Kenya was not reporting it. And as a result, the UN and other international players put pressure on the Kenyan government to stop the violence, and it did, in fact, stop. Did it overturn the election? No. But it changed the result of and saved people's lives. That platform was designed and built as an open platform so that anyone could use it anywhere in the world. And since then, Ushahidi has been used as the de facto mapping tool for crisis mapping throughout the world. So the Haitian earthquake was the Ushahidi mapping was extensively used to first track where people might be buried in rubble, where there were resources, where there was water, where there were hospitals, where there was transportation. And it's still being used. It was used to track the cholera epidemic that was occurring there. And it has been used in everything from forest fires in California to mapping parking spaces in Washington, D.C. during Snowmageddon.
Yeah.
And the head of FEMA has declared Ushahidi as the best tool for reporting and for response that they have ever used, and it's being used extensively. That tool was not built by the federal government or by government agencies or by government employees. It was built outside of the country in Kenya. So just to give you a sense of how quickly this technology can be used and implemented. The second example I'll give you is, and full disclosure, I'm on the board of this company, is a company called Challenge Post, which is trying to create a platform to allow people to post challenges, problems to be solved, and then in effect market them to a community of potential problem solvers. And so Challenge Post is actually now the default platform for the US government challenge system under challenge.gov. So that federal agencies now, when they have a problem, they need an app built, they're trying to get some data cleaned up, they're looking for some new ideas, they use the challenge.gov platform. It's free to agencies to use, and all kinds of people from around the world, whether they be in the United States or not, can look at those challenges and try to solve those problems. So instead of those problems being siloed and trying to be solved in conference rooms in some 1950s era office building in Washington, D.C., or in some state house across the land, these kinds of problems are now being exposed to a much larger market of potential problem solvers. And this is just in the last 2 years. So those two examples portend the fact that there is some opening up of a relationship between government and private sector innovation that is having a huge impact on saving people's lives, saving money, and changing the dynamics under which problems get solved.
True, and I think that the Haiti example is a great one because, you know, using those tools has been so key, but also at the very top level, you know, the U.S., between philanthropy and government, was already feeding 1 in 4 people in Haiti before the earthquake. And now since the earthquake, the U.S. government is actually directly seeking funds from, now this is the top of the food chain, the Gates Foundation, et cetera, to create, you know, more than programs, but to try to remake that society. And they're working very, very closely, between public and private funding to do what is possible there to our near neighbor. Before I jump over to Laura, I want to just put in a quick plug. If you want to follow this stuff, I'm a huge fan of this site. It comes out of the Personal Democracy Forum, techpresident.com. Which I've written a couple things for previously, is the place to follow, to cover. It does a fantastic job of covering the stories around e-government, e-activism, e-philanthropy. We government. Sorry. Yes. Yeah. That's the next job. Laura, you and your site was up there briefly.
I hope you got a chance to see it. Stand up, bring it back up again.
I hope that we all got a quick view of it. But your point that on the public-private side of things was good, and it kind of set up what Andrew said about what's happening elsewhere. Do you see, and we'll work our way down to Richard, do you see some tension between the public side of things and the philanthropy side of things, between nonprofits and governments, to try to team up to, change things? And I can yield you back a minute or so.
Sure.
Like
I just want to and you can hit translate and see it, but you'll see it. It just like there's always live streaming videos, so it's a lot like YouTube meets Facebook. There's a bunch of interviews. Down on the bottom is yours truly, shameless plug, but they asked me, what does it take to be a good fundraiser? That got posted, and then they just drag all content and up-to-date things and forums that you can go see, so that's a platform for it. It's a really good question. Two things. It depends on where you are in the United States. In certain pockets of the United States, there is still strong partnerships on state and local government levels that are helping nonprofits. And in other parts of the United States, it's simply a joke. It is simply a joke. And I tell you, I think, and I just have to bring these two examples, I think the toughest place to fundraise right now in the United States is New Orleans. And I'll tell you why. I was there right after Katrina, and the world was still kind of in shock. But I was just there recently with the Association of Fundraising Professionals have chapters, and they asked me to come speak, and they're still in shock. And I said, well, what's going on? And they said, well, number one, they lost a quarter of their donor base that never came back. Number two, when they finally do talk to people about there's still a great need here, they say to the fundraisers, the federal, state, and local government have turned their backs on us. What could a nonprofit possibly do? So they got lumped in with this kind of like hands-off. So, and in other places, governments are helping nonprofits. My second point is like, what I see is they're reactionary, they're not one step ahead of the curve. One of the groups I work with is Operation Homefront, and they raise all the emergency money for families and the military. And, you know, it is an undeclared war, and it will just, you will die when I tell you the story that in 2009, you know, people say, well, where does the money go if you support Operation Homefront? And people would say, okay, well, like wounded warriors or psychological effects on it. And the number one thing we distributed was food. When these troops come home, they don't have enough money to put food on the table. So anyway, just months ago, Michelle Obama and Jill announced that they're going to do gov.serve because they realized that, you know, you don't walk around and people don't know who's in a military family and who's not. So I just use, and it's supposed to help volunteerism, which I absolutely applaud. But I feel like this is 2 years too late. And this should have happened, you know, while we were in like Iraq and then in Afghanistan, and now what are we doing with, you know, Libya? So I'm finding it that nonprofits are kind of standing still a little bit, deciding should we partner or is it worth it to do something with the government? Which is why I really like this, because in Russia they realize the number one reason why nonprofits aren't successful is they don't have the technology. Or they don't want to learn the technology. So they're trying to make it easy, gentle, whatever, right from the beginning, and then begin to partner. So,
Right. And to go down the line to Richard, this idea of competition versus and collaboration, a lot of the things that you see in terms of new partnerships and new funding involves competition. There's some of the things, part of what new media has brought out over the past few years in philanthropy is a contest culture, where, you know, companies or in some cases governments, you know, put a pot of money aside and then ask nonprofits to compete for it, to get out there and market, to use the tools. And it's having worked with many nonprofits, they already feel like they're jumping through a lot of hoops to compete for the dollars that they do from major gifts, from foundations, which increasingly will not fund general operating and ask for a lot more reporting than they used to. Richard, what are your thoughts about this, you know, competition culture, and the idea that you know, funding has to be competed for in a public square?
A couple of thoughts. One is that one of my favorite statistics is there's a new nonprofit created in the United States on the average of every 15 minutes. 40 to 50,000 new ones a year approved by the IRS and so forth. Part of that is that people have an appetite to do something and they want to start something, and that we have the tools available. The government's not going to tell you no, and so lots and lots of people do this. It's a great thing to do. Some are wildly successful and some, you know, collapse. The dark side of the nonprofit world is there are way too many nonprofits in the United States, and I think what you're going to see, and we're seeing a little bit already, is on the one end there is this proliferation of new nonprofits who either don't want to be stuck with government, they also don't want to be stuck with traditional philanthropies, the big, you know, equally bureaucratic, you know, billion-dollar places like the Red Cross, wonderful place, the Red Cross, but they just don't want to go through that, so they start their own. So you've got that going on the one hand. On the other end, less attended to, I think, is the what in the commercial world is basically the mergers and acquisitions business. I think if I were a nonprofit and advising you, I think that deciding whether you need to be a nonprofit, whether you need to merge or acquire other nonprofits, I think that's, we don't talk about that much. It's very common in every sort of sector except the nonprofits, because there's a culture that we're here, we have a board and so forth. Very few nonprofits that go out of business intentionally. So I think that the idea of, to put it another way, there's just way too much competition. There's going to be more of it internally within our sector and externally. One of my friends at one of the major state universities said, cooperation is not a natural act. for an institution. It is not something that they do well or set up to do. It is something that manufacturers have to do with the supply chain and vendors. It is not something nonprofits are set up to do. So I would challenge nonprofits to think about the mergers and acquisition then, rather than the other end. Can I say one thing about data, which is you triggered a really important point about all the data that's out there, and the federal government has said, how you use it, really, it's your data. That's happening at the state level in a very important way, and if it isn't happening in your state, push hard, because while the federal government is taking the lead, states are also involved. One of our clients is one of the largest women's foundations in the world. It's based in Dallas, Texas. Local foundation just finished a $40 million campaign, headed to a $100 million campaign, which all of you nonprofit folks know is a pretty good sized budget for a local organization. The most important thing they did to generate a lot of money and cooperation at the state government level and in terms of major gifts fundraising was take the Texas state budget and put it through a gender lens. The data was already there, and they just said, we're going to calculate how this affects women and girls in Dallas and Fort Worth and Houston and so forth. What's the budget really mean? Speaking of transparency, and just using the data, they said the best thing they did for their funding was to create the position of research director, just to filter through a gender lens the data that was already existing. And that expense, which many nonprofits resist, opened a tremendous number of doors, including a number of $1 million gifts to this nonprofit for people who simply didn't realize the stakes in certain issues. It was all sitting there in a state budget, but who can read a state budget? Well, they did.
That's very interesting. And we're going to go to questions shortly, so please get ready. But I want to follow up on that with the rest of the panel, because it leads into kind of my final question. There are upsides and downsides to transparency for nonprofits. The upside is more access to people, more channels opened. The challenge that they face is the reporting side of it, their natural unwillingness to share, especially when it comes to potential donors, because they want to keep it to themselves, and the control issue. Wanting control over their message. Many larger, mid-sized nonprofits have spent decades building up the brand in the community. They don't want to let anybody else talk about it. And this is something that I face constantly. So building upon what Richard said, what are, anybody jump in, what are your thoughts about kind of the upside and the downside? Andrew, you said you're an eternal optimist about this, and that we're entering a golden age, but it is a challenge. It's definitely a challenge for organizations that are out there doing important work year to year.
I always say that the way to generate revenue is to build a community, because money is actually a byproduct of community. And if you trust that the people who are in your community may know more about the problem than you do, may have their own ideas about how to raise money, know how to distribute information among their peers, and you trust them, they will respond. And so, just like the government's having trouble figuring out how to use technology, nonprofits are having trouble figuring out how to use technology, but there are better and better examples now. This isn't rocket science anymore. Where you can actually see results from using social media, using technology platforms to engage with your community, engage with the people you're trying to help directly, and build an entirely new culture that generates revenue sources that you would never have expected before. So 90% of philanthropy, and this may sound cynical, but I don't mean it to be, is that 90% of philanthropy is really about the conspicuous display of one's social connections. People, go to chicken dinner, rubber chicken dinners, galas, and they honor people, and that generally generates a huge amount of revenue for a lot of nonprofits. And I'm not saying that shouldn't occur, but a great example of this from a political perspective. How many of you have ever heard of Common Cause? So, very well-known organization. My parents are members. Well, Common Cause could have been Move On. They literally were using direct mail and old-fashioned fundraising techniques throughout all their chapters, and completely missed the opportunities around technology that have appeared in the last 10 years. And so now they're struggling to catch up. But the problem is that a lot of their members are beyond an innovative age. And so they're having trouble connecting with young people to re-engage around Common Cause. to Richard's point, I'm not suggesting the Common Cause do this tomorrow, but not only should there be some mergers, but some nonprofits should just go away. We're not doing enough of an analysis of what is actual success. What is the quotient for a success of an organization? Is it just perpetuating itself, or is it actually solving the problem that it's intended to solve? That's a whole other question about what, and I suspect the technology is going to help solve this, which is to start making the process of fundraising and the work of nonprofits also more transparent to the public, so that the best and most effective nonprofits get the most support because they're actually able to showcase their data in a public way, showcase their effectiveness in a public way, and showcase their community in a public way, rather than this, as Richard was mentioning, this sort of closed, protect, don't want to share my donors, don't want to tell anybody, because they're afraid. We're going through a major transformation from an era of closed top-down hierarchies to open networks. And so the nonprofit that wants to maintain a siloed perspective is probably going to be obsolete and a dinosaur within the next 5 or 10 years.
And I would add that the future donor pool is going to expect the openness, the data at their fingertips, and that outside of what foundations are doing, the public reporting that foundations, that nonprofits and foundations have to do right now is relatively small. Let's start some questions. If you have a question, please stand up. I think we have some microphones, and please state your name because we are filming. Howard.
Thank you. I'm Howard Greenstein. I teach here at the Center for Philanthropy and Fundraising. One of the comments early on was about government funding for nonprofits making situations political, and the situation of being in a position of having to either lobby for your cause or whatever. But I know that nonprofit status can be challenged if you are too active in government and lobbying, and how do the nonprofits balance that need to actually go out and yell at their congressman, "Don't cut my funding," versus the line that gets drawn of you can't be a lobbyist if you're a nonprofit.
Maybe down that end. So you guys.
Well, just a quick comment that thank goodness I'm not a lawyer, but the nonprofits very poorly understand what they can and cannot do and so forth, so you need to get a good lawyer, I guess. But I think the other issue is that the traditional approach was you create another organization, yet another organization that is not necessarily nonprofit or tax deductible, hard money, soft money.
501c4.
Yeah, that sort of thing, and I think that's been the key. And I think that the other response has been active education for all policymakers, like our friends in Dallas that I mentioned. They have everybody who's newly elected to the state legislature immediately gets a training program about the women's and girls' issues. Doesn't matter what party you are on. They certainly have a information bias, if you will. So I think we just frankly have to toughen up and be willing to take our lumps, and a few of us are going to lose our tax exemption, but we may help our causes.
One of the things I've seen is some of the nonprofits that I've worked with who know they can be influential, they just follow the elections. And I've seen them literally divide, like, you'll take this party, I'll take this party. And they begin to be insiders with them as they develop it, because state budgets get developed and state causes get developed. So, and there's nothing illegal or wrong about that. They just want to have a piece of what their future plan, strategic plan, if you will, per state is happening. So, that's another way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Have a list of expert witnesses. That's a different thing than a lobbyist. Expert witnesses on your issue, and then people leave you alone.
Right.
I have a question. I'm Doug White from the Hyman Center, the academic director, and the question of silo and not silo is very important to me, not only because we come from a traditional nonprofit here at NYU and a fairly traditional structure, but as we look at changing our own center and how we look forward to the future, I'd like to get your thoughts as to what you mean by not siloing. I will stand at the front of that line and champion that concept, but I want to know how it looks, because not only will it affect how we do our business, but we also are in the job of training people, teaching people. And what are we trying to tell these new students as we look forward to the new world of philanthropy? So I lom onto the idea of not siloing, but if you could explain what that means more tangibly, please.
If I could ask a question. So the students you're teaching, you're teaching them here at NYU?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so...
We have a master's and a non-credit program.
And to what degree is the curriculum, the intellectual capital that you're sharing, available online?
More and more of it is being put online. I will tell you that we have been lapped by a lot of organizations throughout the country, and we like to think of ourselves as one of the leaders, and I do think we are in many ways. But on that particular point, you got me.
Well, sorry, I mean, that illustrates the issue. I mean, this may sound like I don't know if it's the exact statistic as it relates to NYU, but education is going through a massive transformation. Public schools, and I know colleges are different, but public schools are only open 15% of all the time in the year. Physically open. And we're still putting computers in schools and wiring classrooms, and kids are only in those schools and in those classrooms a fraction of that time. So the idea of taking think of your organization as a 24/7 organization that isn't tied to a physical building and has community members of interest, people who have knowledge, people who want the knowledge, who are in your community, and connecting them to each other 24/7, asynchronously or synchronously, should be a goal to make your organization a virtual one as well as a physical one.
It is a goal, and it is also happening. Just so you'll know, even though I do acknowledge we've been lapped, we're catching up. We have a very advanced online program, and a lot of our programs, or a lot of our courses, are being put on it as we speak. So we're in that mindset, believe me. But then let's assume we'll have some success there.
Okay.
Then the question becomes, we are a 24/7 classroom/lab. We have our physical classes, which we'll never give up because we think there's a real value there,
course,
and I think
sure.
you'd agree with that.
Right.
What do we mean, though, when we're not siloed? I'd like to spread out, too. Today's an example of that. But what do we mean in terms of our course offerings not being siloed, and as well as our fundraising efforts as well?
Well, so what other organizations that you touch could you partner with and share curriculum with, that they could take your information and make it available to other people that you're not necessarily controlling or managing?
We're doing that internally right now to a degree we've never done, and what I mean by internally is within NYU, which is a
larger silo.
A larger silo. Well, I guess by that standard, there's a great big world silo in which we would fall. But really, I think that's a large step. And I'm glad you're actually grilling me on that, because it's making me understand and better understand where we need to go. We have made large progress, a large number of steps in that direction. But you're talking about outside of NYU, I believe.
Well, I mean, of course. I mean, NYU touches the world. I mean, NYU doesn't like to think of itself as a siloed institution. It thinks of itself as an open institution that's creating educational opportunities worldwide.
Well, we have faculty who are all over the world. Laura just talked about one of her experiences. We had somebody who was over at the German Congress last week. We're talking to somebody in Spain right now. I'm going to Andorra in 2 months. We are touching other places around the world. I'd like to know.
Well, I'll give you another
What
example.
structure we
I'll give you another example. How do you form your curriculum every year? Do you interview your own professors?
Yes.
Okay. Do you actually ever create open opportunities for people to suggest courses and then
Yes.
fill them?
Yes.
And that's from the academics or also from the students?
From the students as well. Well, the academics, but the students are playing a large role in that.
Okay. And are you allowed to look for funding outside of NYU?
Yes.
So then you're not a siloed organization.
All right, Doug.
Well, I'd like to think we have, well, thanks for that. We passed that test. But really, is that what you mean, though? Is that what you're getting at? Is what you've just described, to which?
I mean, if you think about the American Cancer Society, which is an institution that has millions of donors, there's lots of other cancer organizations out there, and they don't necessarily want to share their information, their data, their donors, or their tactics, because their livelihood, their ability to maintain themselves is tied to that. In your particular case, your being open and connected doesn't threaten your existence. And if anything, it adds to your allure, because you're an open educational institution that's looking to connect with partners. So if you can create different ways in which people can interact with you, you're either as students, as faculty, as potential part-time faculty, part-time students, or other organizations that would want to leverage your intellectual capital, then you're no longer really a siloed institution. You're starting to think about yourself as a network as opposed to a fixed organization.
What do I want to add about the silo piece of it, which I think is really good? I think, and in my experience, the people who do not want to partner, and it starts with either the CEO or the board, because anyone who goes on a board wants to think that the organization is the best and the brightest, and we don't have to partner, and foundations are helping because they're giving out larger grants to people who are being collaborative.
Right.
But it begins and ends with the board that says, yes, but we do something so much more unique. If we don't collaborate, more of the money stays here within our organization, to which I'm a board member. So one of the things that we can do here at NYU, and I'm on their faculty, is to begin to, well, I always love, it's a very old expression, but I think it's very apropos, is we've got to train people to lead up and have those kind of serious discussions so that they can go inside their own boards and talk about the power of collaboration and sharing information, and that kind of breaks down some of the walls, but it begins and ends with what the board wants and does not want to do.
Add a practical suggestion to, I think, of the original question here, which is functions may always necessarily be somewhat siloed. Someone has to be in charge of this or that or the other thing. Information, though, is siloed for that very same reason. Education departments at conservation organizations often have lots of information. They consider it theirs, as opposed to the fundraising department, the finance office. Donor information often comes in to the fundraising department, isn't shared with the program people because we wouldn't want to pollute their good ideas with our gritty fundraising stuff. So I think one thing that an organization can do, all of you, is aggressively lobby for the unsiloing of information about program donors and get out to all departments, whether or not you can actually change functionally what they do. And I think that's one of the quickest things that can break down organizational silos.
And to that point, and I know you have a few more questions, when I talk to the organizations that I work with, a lot of siloing is the perception of being closed. And so when we're talking about some of these new media tools, I often urge them to not think of themselves as a broadcast center, but as part of an external conversation. And that goes and that's from the top down. It's not just hire an intern to run Twitter for you, or hire your friend's 20-year-old daughter to do Facebook, but to actually be present in those media at some point, understanding that you're not going to do that 24/7. But that can signal to potential partners, to potential funders, especially the young philanthropists coming along, that you are more open and that your organization is not siloed. Further questions? Yes, you had your hand up there.
My name's Andrea Rogers, and I'm an adjunct professor at NYU Wagner, so that means that we're not siloed. I'm actually coming to another school within NYU. My question was about, I'm a student and a professional in global philanthropy, and when we talk about technology, it makes quite a bit of assumptions about infrastructure. And having worked quite a bit in the global south, I just came back from Liberia, where to imagine what it's like to download a PDF document from a very poor base of infrastructure is incredible. So when we talk about, the most effective NGOs that are the most transparent and the most visible on the web are going to be the ones that get the most resources. This is kind of seems like it's become the new glossy annual report. It doesn't mean that those are the organizations that are actually doing the work on the ground. So if you could talk a little bit about that when you're talking about the global south, lack of infrastructure, everybody can't get on broadband and download documents. So just to talk about that in terms of resources and
I'm sorry, I want to
philanthropy.
dispute. I don't think anybody here is specifically saying the web. In fact, I would argue that a lot of the best philanthropic activities around community problem solving are done through mobile platforms and not even smartphones, just plain text messaging. I'll give you one great example. There's an organization that I'm involved with called PopTech, which is a conference up in Maine that brings innovators together. And a young woman from South Africa came to tell us about how, first of all, she runs a hospice. She herself is HIV positive. Half of her family had died of AIDS. The hospice that she runs, 40% of the nurses are HIV positive, and 40% of the country of South Africa is HIV positive. And the government was in denial about HIV. There was no public awareness campaign. There was one single 800 number for information. So a traditional nonprofit would go and analyze that problem and say, we need to raise $50 million to do a public awareness campaign, get billboards by PSA time on television, and get the word out for people to wear condoms, to get themselves tested, and to change the culture of fear associated with HIV. That would be the traditional way. Well, no one's going to raise that $50 million. Gates Foundation wasn't rushing to the table. All the traditional philanthropists have been fighting the AIDS battle at that point, for more than a decade. So we put her together with some technologists and looked at the infrastructure of people communicating in South Africa and discovered that there are 35 million text messages sent in South Africa every single day, of which 7 million are only 3 letters, PCM, which stands for please call me. Because a lot of people in South Africa don't have minutes on their phone, so they send a PCM to their friends asking who have minutes for them to call them. That leaves 157 characters of unused space in every one of those PCM messages. So we went to the second largest telco in South Africa and asked them whether we could embed a public service announcement into that white space in 5% of all those PCM text messages. And they agreed. And within a year, 100,000 people were tested for HIV. That over 1 million people are in their database. And now that program is expanding to cover tuberculosis and diphtheria in Congo and Tanzania. So and that was done with literally no money on an infrastructure where people weren't online, people did not have access to the web, weren't able to download a PDF, wouldn't even know what it is, and are still waiting for Nicholas Negroponte to distribute those laptops that everyone keeps talking about that are also a kind of a joke. But my point is that innovation's happening, and it doesn't require broadband for it to happen. It requires will and creativity.
2 more questions. Yes.
Hi, my name is Kay Yates. I'm a master's student here at the Hyman Center. And I'm very interested in how do I get the urban youth culture here in the United States involved in philanthropy through the pop culture and through the things that they're doing automatically. Do you have any ideas or suggestions?
Panel? It's a good question.
Youth, age-wise, what do we?
I'm looking at maybe 15 to 24 as the target market that corporations are going after, as the target market that actually is changing pop culture every day. But they're not really involved in, especially the urban youth market, it's not really involved in philanthropy.
What do you mean by philanthropy? Do you mean
Giving
philanthropy,
money.
giving money?
Yeah.
Giving money and just knowing what philanthropy is. I'm more into social change philanthropy because most of the urban youth don't have the funds like that foundations can give or something, but just bringing attention to the problems.
I'm sorry, I have to challenge the notion of philanthropy. I don't think philanthropy is about giving money.
Okay.
I think philanthropy is about giving of your talents to solve problems when you're not getting paid for it. And there are lots of examples of people, and the organization I mentioned earlier, Mouse, the students in Mouse not only wire and fix the technology in their public schools, they go out into the community, they teach elderly how to get online, they build networks for small businesses, they fix computers for their friends and neighbors. That's philanthropy. They're not giving money. They're not signing up for a gala, but they're volunteering their time. That's philanthropy. So I think that one is rethink what philanthropy means, and second, you have to look at the communication tools that those young people are using and reach them through those same tools. If you're trying to put an ad in the New York Times that says, hey, if you're 16 years old and living in Bushwick, you should be a philanthropist, you're wasting your money.
I would also say scale is important in that equation. Pick something, a project or a cause where the change will be apparent and can be achieved. It's a stretch, it's a reach. You'll have to bring a lot of people to the table to do it. You might want to use all these tools to help organize them, but something that is achievable. Because the last thing you want to do is to throw, a bunch of young people at a problem that they can't necessarily solve. That's not going to build a mentality of being able to do something.
One last suggestion, ask them.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent point.
Ask them. Get
Right, what
30
do they
of them in
wanna
a room
change?
and ask them how to grow that community. They know better than you do.
Can I just add that you touched on something important, philanthropy, which is a word we should probably get rid of from the language. It's too pure and too irrelevant, I think, now. How's that for throwing a bomb on the party? But I think it's not the entry point for most people. It's the result of a previous entry point of 47% of the people online who made a gift last year in one study, had first done something else, signed a pledge, bought a stuffed, endangered animal and so forth, did something to show their support. Philanthropy came later. So I think anyone looking at
Yes.
philanthropy as a starting point is missing the boat.
Yeah, one more question. Yes, sir.
Sorry, Jeremy Kill, I publish Black Tie magazine. I probably deal with more rich philanthropists in the country than nearly anybody else. I just think philanthropy is wonderful, and I wouldn't throw away the brand recognition of it. I love your point about it's more than just giving money, it's giving of your talents and what you can do. Big question. I mean, we've got declining government expenditures here all across the world. We got trillions coming out of the American budget. If we don't, S&P don't decide to downgrade our bonds anymore, that will stop. We got 20% reduction in England, working on it right now. Against that, philanthropy is our sort of acceptable face of our new aristocracy in America. It's a great point of contact with some of the richest, most powerful people. And personally, I think the biggest thing about the last 5 years is not so much Facebook and Twitter and things. They've been useful. The greatest achievement is that philanthropy is being adopted by all these people as being their definer, what they want. I mean, it's not about having 4 cars and 5 houses in the Hamptons anymore. It's about being on the chairs of these committees and doing some good. My question to you, and I think it's a really hard question, we've got declining government expenditure. We've got a huge increase in need here in the States, particularly, just to keep it local for a minute. And we've got a demand on philanthropy to kind of fill the void and take advantage of the resources available. What about that question? I mean, what are we going to do in, I think we're going to look back in the next couple of years, and these are going to look like the good days.
Let me jump in first on that. I don't think philanthropy, this is my personal opinion, I don't think philanthropy can fill the void. I think the role of government is crucial, and I think that we as citizens of a democratic republic have to take that responsibility seriously and make sure that we do not gut government to the state that in terms of our social infrastructure that it becomes a skeleton. I think that would be a huge mistake for the future of this country. That said, I do agree that philanthropy is feeling the pressure to fill that gap. And I think that bringing in, the Warren Buffett's club, which we've heard quite a lot about, to help fill those gaps, is positive in some ways because it brings more assets to the table. It's problematic in other ways because we didn't elect these people. And what they might decide to focus on may not. I might not trust Larry Ellison to be the new social scientist for the country. What he might want to give his billions to may not be something that I want to give his billions to. So I think that professionals in the philanthropy sector, the nonprofit leadership, is going to be crucial over this next decade and should be open and active and self-provoking to find where the answers are. It's kind of a broad answer, but that's what I think.
I think it's dangerous to emphasize the gap. I think it's more positive to say the need is always escalating. And whether the government helps or not, what can an individual nonprofit do? And what can they do to their potential? And if everyone's working to their potential, the need will, by and large, be taken care of as much as it can. But that it's a tough sell about government, because in the minute you start talking about that, you get into a lot of politics, you get a lot of people negative attitude, and suddenly there's kind of less willing because they're angry that something else has happened. So I'd rather reverse it and say there's an escalating need, there's always going to be an escalating need, so let's see where the philanthropic organization can do to lessen that need. And I think that's a better approach to it. It has more appeal, it's more sellable, and I think that's where the dollars get raised.
And we're going to have to end this right here, and I'm very sorry to have to do this. What a time to have to end it. I'm left with so many images here today, not the least of which is Dick McPherson saying that philanthropy is irrelevant. I love that comment from one of our faculty members, but it does need to be taken into context, Richard.
Put it up on YouTube and raise some money around it.
But Andrew and John and Dick and Laura, I love you, and Tom, you did a fabulous job. Let's have a good hand for these guys. I would like to tell you that we're going to do this again next year. This is our last one this year, and we can't thank Marcia Stepanek enough for putting this together. Listen up for the next time we have this coming next fall, and it's going to just get better and better. And again, thank you for our best session yet.
Pleasure to meet you, too. Thank you.